Welcome everybody to the LSAT Test Prep Part 2. Now, I already covered the basics of what the LSAT is at the beginning of Part 1, so if you missed that, go ahead and review that material. But today, I want to dive right into logical reasoning, also known as arguments. For the LSAT arguments, I want to give you 5 essential strategies. The first of these is that we want to restate things as being equal. You're going to see how this works as we go along. But essentially, when they give you a prompt, you're going to want to take that prompt, interpret it, and then restate it, but in your own words. Very, very important. Number 2, you're going to see a lot of if A, then B, which means, as you're reading through the prompt, if I see something happening as being true or factual, I have to watch out for the therefore this other thing will also be true or factual. So we're going to see a lot of the if A then B type of constructions in this particular section of the LSAT. Now, tip number 3, think for yourself before you look at the answer choices. Again, very important to do it before looking at the answer choices. Why is that critical? We don't want to get distracted by what the answer choices show us. That is one of the pitfalls of doing a multiple choice time-based test like this, is to get wrapped up into all of the answer choices, to not have a good design or understanding of what you're looking for, and then simply say, well, is A possible? I don't know. How about B? I'm not sure. How about C? That sounds like it's possible. You see how you can be very wishy-washy, blown like the wind, by all of the answer choices if you don't have a strong game plan going into it. So I'm going to teach you how to develop a strong game plan before you look at the answer choices. Number 4, active POE, what I like to call process of elimination, as many of us know. But I'm going to show you how to do it actively. We all understand we have to cross off wrong answer choices. But how do we do that? Actively process of elimination. To do it actively means to attack the answer choices, to go at it with aggression, to understand what you're looking for as an answer, and to actively and strongly cross off the wrong ones that do not fit your expectations. That's how you do active process of elimination. And again, I'll show you plenty of examples as we go along. The 5th and final example, or 5th and final key strategy, is to determine whether your final answer holds water or not. This oftentimes comes into play when you have 2 possible ending answer choices and you're trying to decide between the 2 which one is better. You have to evaluate which one of those 2 holds water better. Which one is more leak-proof? Which one, when you put it back in with the rest of the prompt, makes better sense? That's the one you want to go with. All right, those are the 5 key strategies. Now we're going to get right to the examples. Here we go. First, we have the sample instructions. You can read that here, but essentially you're going to be given approximately 25 questions, somewhere in that 23 to 28 question range. You will have 35 minutes to answer all of those questions. And remember that there is no penalty for wrong answers. Therefore, you want to guess away, towards the very end. Never leave anything blank. All right, so you can read those directions there. Let's jump into the questions. Let's do a sample question number 1. Now, all of these questions are on an actual former LSAT test, so you can be rest assured that these questions are legitimate. These are actual previous questions on a previous LSAT. So you know that they are very good indicators of what future questions might look like. So this first question says editorial. A lot of times they'll start that way. They'll give you frame the text as being from something. So this is an editorial such as you would find in a newspaper, for example, an editor of the newspaper saying what he or she thinks about an important topic. The city has chosen a contractor to upgrade the heating systems in public buildings. Only 40% of the technicians employed by this contractor are certified by the Heating Technicians Association. So the city selected a contractor, 60% of whose technicians are unqualified, which is an outrage. Make sure to now read the question. Which one of the following is an assumption required by the argument in the editorial? So you always want to read the question and understand what you're looking for. Here we're seeing an example of if A, then B. Here's what I mean. If A is true, then B is true. In this core text, the editor went from 40% certified to 60% unqualified. Now, those are not the same thing, but you see how there is a change in semantics, change in wording? You have to be very attentive to when that happens. Here we're seeing that there was a change from certified to unqualified, but they are not the same thing. So, therefore, what is the assumption here? The assumption is that if a person is not certified, it means they are not qualified. See, that's the missing piece. To make a leap of faith from A to B, we're missing an assumption. That's the missing assumption. Now that we have pre-crafted what we believe the answer to be, remember how I said think for yourself, then we can safely do process of elimination. So now when we attack with process of elimination, we can see that A says certified technicians receive higher pay than uncertified technicians. No, there's no talk about pay. A is wrong. B, there are no contractors with fewer than 40% of their technicians certified. No, that's not what we're saying, and that is not an assumption. C, technicians who lack certification are not qualified technicians. Yes, that matches our prediction. So you see what we're doing here. We're predicting our answer based on our understanding, our deep understanding of the text prompt before we look at answer choices, so that when we look at those answer choices, we're coming in with an informed position and we have an actual direction we're taking so that we can make sure they line up properly. So C is the right answer. Let's go to question number 2. Janetta. Increasingly, I've noticed that when a salesperson thanks a customer for making a purchase, the customer also says, thank you, instead of saying, you're welcome. I've even started doing that myself. But when a friend thanks a friend for a favor, the response is always, you're welcome. Which one of the following, if true, most helps to explain the discrepancy that Janetta observes in people's responses? So before we go any further, we have to make sure to think for ourselves. Why would a customer say thank you back? Right? As opposed to when you're with a friend and they've done you a favor. Why would you say thank you back to a salesperson? So again, imagine yourself in a store, and this is the way you do it if you're a little bit confused about the prompt. You want to go ahead and set an example for yourself. Pick your favorite store. Let's say Kohl's. I've recently been in a Kohl's. So I would think to myself, I walk into Kohl's, I make a purchase, and as I'm leaving, the salesperson says, thank you, Mr. Powell. And I say back to them, thank you. Why would I do that? So again, make yourself an easy example that is personalized to put you into the moment, to insert you into the text, to get your mind thinking and to get you involved in what you're doing. If you use that example, you would realize that I would say thank you back if I received a good service, if I actually got something from that relationship. For example, I went to try on a pair of jeans and they explained to me how wide jeans and skinny jeans work. And so now I know I'm more of a skinny jean person. You see, they've given me something. They've given me a service. And I ended up buying the skinny jeans in size 32, which I thought I needed a 30, but in fact I needed a 32. You see how this can be a situation where I would say thank you because I felt like I got something? There we go. And again, you want to look for keywords. In this particular prompt, you're seeing the words for a favor. Somebody doing you a favor. So what's different about a sales transaction from someone doing a favor? Those are two very different things, and we have to understand why. It's because they're a different style of transaction. When someone does you a favor, they're almost never getting something out of it. Right? So when they do a favor and you're like, okay, thank you, they would never say, oh, thank you. No, they did you a favor. All right. So now we look for the answer that matches what we thought about in our own head before we looked at the answer choices. So A says customers regard themselves as doing salespeople a favor by buying from them as opposed to someone else. Now that's a very interesting answer choice because it actually sounds right. But let me tell you that it is not. Answer choice A is one of those classic opposite answer choices. It's actually the opposite of what we're looking for. We are looking for the perspective of when customers say thank you to a salesperson. But A is looking at customers regarding themselves as doing the salesperson a favor by buying from them. That's just proof that a salesperson is going to say, oh, thank you, Mr. Powell. That is not proof that Mr. Powell, meaning me, is going to thank the salesperson. You see, so that A answer choice is very tricky. You're going to see this a lot. It's the opposite answer choice. It sounds very attractive, but it's incorrect. Again, when I think about something that looks, I don't know, if the answer ends up being something like dark, some answer choice that has a lot of words that talks about something being light actually can seem attractive. Not because it's correct, but because it is the opposite. It is on that spectrum. And when we envision a spectrum, that sometimes can trick us because the spectrum is very clearly at one end or the other. And for us to choose one end is attractive to us. And it's what our mind sometimes jumps to incorrectly. So A is wrong because it's the opposite of what we're looking for. B says salespeople are often instructed by their employers to thank customers, whereas customers are free to say what they want. Now, B is very tricky because it is that classic answer choice, which makes you feel like, you've spoken a truism. It's the, hey, that sounds true option. Now, that is very, very dangerous as well, because when we read an answer choice without having thought for ourselves, we can be tempted to answer something like answer choice B, because honestly, it sounds like the truth. Hey, I've worked in retail, and yeah, it's true. My employer would always teach me to say thank you to the customer. Yeah, that sounds legit. And then customers are free to say what they want. Yeah, there's freedom of speech in the United States. All that sounds legit. And so we answer choice B because it is all true. That would be wrong. Things that are true but do not have relevance to the question are not the right answer. B is incorrect. It has nothing to do with why a customer would say thank you back. It doesn't. The customer is free to say what they want. That gives no evidence or any more information as to why a customer would say thank you to a salesperson. B is incorrect. Let's go to C. Salespeople do not regard customers who buy from them as doing them a favor. That's just convoluted logic. That's just not helpful. It's essentially saying, it's a twisting of words. Salespeople are not the focus here. What is the focus is the customer's perspective. C is incorrect. How about D? The way that people respond to being thanked is generally determined by habit rather than by conscious decision. That just speaks to why the person would react how they do. That's kind of outside of the scope. It's kind of a who cares kind of an answer choice. So again, don't be attracted by things that derail you, get you off track. Stay on track. E is the answer choice that stays on track in a commercial transaction as opposed to a favor. You see how they're doing the contrasting the two? The customer feels that the benefits are mutual. What does mutual mean? It means you do something for me and I do something for you. It goes two ways. It's a two-way street. So E is definitely the right answer because it matches completely with what we predicted. All right, so you understand how all of this works. You understand how the thinking for yourself before looking at the answer choices works. You understand how the process of elimination works. Let's go to a question number 3. Again, we're getting more and more practice, getting hopefully better at this as we go. Here's how it reads. Some video game makers have sold the movie rights for popular games. However, this move is rarely good from a business perspective. After all, Star Quanta sold the movie rights to its popular game Nostromo, but the poorly made film adaptation of the game was hated by critics and the public alike. Subsequent versions of the Nostromo video game, although better than the original, sold poorly. The question is, the reasoning in the argument is most vulnerable to criticism in that the argument does what? So again, when you read that question, you have to start thinking, what am I looking to do? I'm looking to poke a hole in it. There is some kind of criticism, and it is going to cut through this argument. What can I use to cut through it? In order to cut through something, you have to know what that something is. In order to destroy an argument, you have to know how the argument is constructed. And here we go. We have to figure out what's happening. What is the argument here? The argument, and something that's very important to note, you're going to see that a lot of the time spent in this prompt is talking about star quanta and Nostromo. They are giving you a single example in order to illustrate a broader point. All right, that's how you stop and summarize. You take the argument and say, what are they really saying? Well, they're making a general statement based on a very specific example. They're claiming that game makers selling movie rights is a bad idea. And do they give you multiple examples? No. They give you one example to prove that larger point. So you have to be able to see that. And the reason why if-then comes into play is what they're essentially saying, if this is true for Star Quanta's Nostromo game, then it's also true for all video game makers who are selling their movie rights. That's how the if-then works. And this happens frequently in this section, frequently in argumentation. It's that whole causational issue where if something happens to be true, then something else is also going to naturally follow. And sometimes that argument is good. And in this case, sometimes that argument is fallacious or wrong. Let's look at now some of the answer choices. It is vulnerable to criticism in that the argument draws a general conclusion on the basis of just one individual case. Hey, that sounds great. We did an excellent job of figuring out what it looked like to begin with, so that when we saw answer choice A, it lined up perfectly. And now we know that A is right and we can move on. Now I'm going to make a brief note, and this is good for anyone taking any kind of test, but especially in a time-based test where the time is very constricted. You have very limited time to do a lot of problems. In those instances, what I like to call a barometer or a gauge, you have to be very knowledgeable about your own barometer. You have to understand how well you are at identifying the right answer. This is done through practice. Practice problems, quizzes, in this case, practicing LSAT, previous questions on the LSAT. That's all going to help you enormously in having that gauge, that barometer to understand how well or maybe how poorly you are able to immediately jump to the right answer. So that means if you have a high confidence level in your ability to think for yourself, come up with a prediction, and your matching is very good, if that's all in place, you can safely answer A and move on to the next question because it will save you time. But if your barometer is pretty weak and you're not able to do that on a consistent basis, and you're only getting 20 or 30% of those kinds of questions correct, then you know that your barometer is weak and you have to actually go through the rest of B, C, D, and E to make sure that you've covered your bases. I'm going to assume that your instincts are very solid, and for that reason, I'm going to say that A is correct, but just for argument's sake, let's look at the others so that I'm helping you to fully understand what you're looking at. Now, for answer choice B, it says, infers that a product will be disliked by the public merely from the claim that the product was disliked by critics. And I would answer that that is not inference. It is actually clearly stated. Those are two opposite things. If you're inferring something, you are not stating it directly. But if you have stated something directly, you are no longer inferring. You are coming right out and saying it. So B is actually incorrect. C says restates as a conclusion a claim earlier presented as evidence for that conclusion. And here's where I would say this could be correct, but again, it is very convoluted logic. There's a lot of arguments going on here, and it can really confuse you. It can really confuse a person taking the LSAT. My strong recommendation is that this kind of stuff generally is there to mess with you, and you should only believe it if you yourself thought it up during that thinking stage where you looked at it before the answer choices, where you predicted what the right answer would be. If you predicted the right answer and it kind of lines up with C, now you're onto something. Now it's possible that C is correct. But without that, do not be tempted by C. If what you wrote or if what you came up with by yourself does not come close to C, then just write it off as being convoluted logic, weird logic, crazy logic. C is wrong. D says, takes for granted that products with similar content that are in different media will be of roughly equal popularity. Well, that may or may not be true, but really it's outside of the scope of what we're dealing with here. It's one of those who cares answer choices. Again, if something feels like it's outside of the scope, it probably is. Again, you want to use your barometer, your radar, to understand how well or poorly you're able to do that. And over time, you'll get better and better as you practice more and more problems. E says, treats a requirement for a product to be popular as something that ensures that a product will be popular. Again, it's this convoluted logic. If what you came up with doesn't match up with that pretty much, don't worry about it, it's wrong. And that's how you know that answer choice A is correct for this question number 3. Let's move on to question number 4, please. And 4 says the following. Principle. The executive in a given company whose compensation package is determined by advice of an external consultant is likely to be overcompensated if the consultant also has business interests with the company the executive manages. Which one of the following judgments conforms most closely to the principle stated above? So again, we want to go through our steps. So the first step is to take what we just read, the prompt, and because the question is essentially saying which of the following, pretty much conforms to what this says, all it's asking you to do is restate what we already said as being equal. And that's all it's asking you to do. Restate as equal. So let's take that prompt and say, well, what is that? What is it really saying? We want to use different words to describe the same thing. Essentially, if I were to restate as equal, I would say that when an executive at a company is having his financial package set up, if he uses an external consultant, he's probably going to be paid too much if that external consultant actually has business dealings with the company. It's kind of one of those, hey, you pat me on the back and I'll pat you on the back in return, meaning tit for tat, you do me a favor, I do you a favor. That's kind of what's happening here. All right. And so now we have restated what that prompt looks like. We can now see which of these answer choices lines up with that. A says the president of the corporation is definitely overpaid since he receives in salary and benefits almost 40 times more than the average employee of Trosco. Well, the amount more that he makes than the average employee is not relevant. So we would not worry about A. A is not correct. How about B? The president is probably overpaid since his annual compensation package was determined 5 years ago when profits were at an all-time high. Again, that does not tie back in the consultant, the idea of an external consultant and his or her relationship with the company. So B is clearly wrong. It's irrelevant. How about C? The president is probably not overpaid since his total compensation package was determined by the board of directors without the services of an external compensation consultant. So this is kind of like one of those not A, therefore not B, but we're actually looking for A, therefore B. So C is incorrect. Let's look at D. The president of the corporation is probably overpaid since the board of directors determined his compensation by following the advice of an external consultant who has many other contracts with Trosco. You see how D is simply a restatement of the text that we were initially given? That's how you know it's correct, because we are restating as equal, right? That upper right corner. We're restating as equal what the prompt says. We're using our own words, and then we're seeing how they indeed match up with one of those answer choices really, really well. All right, so D is the right answer for number 4. Let's go on to number 5. It starts with science writer. Lemaitre argued that the universe began with the explosion of a primeval atom, a singular point of infinite gravity in space and time. If this is correct, our current observations should reveal galaxies accelerating away from one another. This is precisely what we observe. Yet because there is another theory, the oscillating universe theory, that makes exactly the same prediction, Lemaitre's theory must be considered inadequate. Now here's the question. Which one of the following most accurately describes a flaw in the science writer's reasoning? Again, we're looking for a flaw in the reasoning. To know what the flaw is, or to identify the flaw, we first have to, of course, understand the reasoning itself. What is the reasoning happening? Here we have to, again, think about thinking for yourself, making it as equal, all right, because we're basically taking the argument and putting it in our own words. How do we summarize what those words say? Well, here's one way to summarize. We have a first theory, and this theory ends up in a certain conclusion. I don't want to get into specifics because I don't want to get confused. Then a second other theory ends up with the same conclusion. And by doing so, the second theory destroys the first. Now you have to ask yourself, because the question is asking what most accurately describes a flaw, we need to ask ourselves, what's wrong with this kind of thinking? Because we're trying to find a flaw, right? So when we look for a flaw, we say, what's wrong with this thinking? And you got to stop and think. If a first theory predicts a certain conclusion, and then a second theory predicts also the same conclusion, therefore we have to disregard the first, that's not really fair, because having another alternative reason does not allow you to destroy a previous theory. That's just not how it works. You haven't disproven the first theory. You simply have a different theory that comes to the same conclusion. That's not enough to then destroy or cross off that first theory. So now that we've identified the flaw, we look for a matching answer choice. A says, the conclusion is derived partly from assertions attributed to a purported expert whose credibility is not established. No, there is actually no expert mentioned here at all. I guess you could say that Lemaitre he's not considered an expert. He is the guy who made the theory. So he's really the theorist. But maybe you got confused and thought it might have been an expert. But again, even if you thought that, there's no place where Lemaitre's credibility is challenged in a direct way. So A is incorrect. How about B? The conclusion is based on a shift of meaning of a key term from one part of the argument to another part. No, we don't see that. We don't see a shift in meaning of anything. How about C? The science writer takes for granted the existence of a causal connection between observed phenomena. That means A caused B to happen. Maybe you could argue that there's a causal connection between oscillating universe theory and the accelerating away of galaxies one from another. But again, it doesn't really address the flaw in the reasoning. We already stated that the flaw is that having a second theory does not justify destroying the first. And C does not really address that at all. How about D? How about D? The science writer fails to see that one theory is correctly predicting observed data cannot itself constitute evidence against an alternative theory that also does this. Do you see how it's pretty much saying equal things, just using different words? That's what we're talking about here. Using, again, saying the same thing, but using different words. That's what we did to summarize, and that's what answer choice D is doing also. So D is clearly the right answer. Finally, E, the science writer presumes, without providing justification, that there are only two possible explanations for the phenomena in question. This is, again, one of those, gee, it sounds good kind of answer choices. Yeah, pretty much what you said is true. He is presuming that there's only two possible explanations, but again, it does not, whether that's true or not, that statement does not describe the flaw in reasoning. And that's what we're trying to get to. Therefore, E is clearly not correct. I'm trying to give you as much content as possible. And as you're going through this, if you're watching on video at a later time, you may want to just pause your video for each question, pause it, and try to do the question by yourself. After you've tried for 2, 3, 5 minutes, then continue to play the video so you can see how I describe the answers. That's the best way to utilize this. And so you may want to even rewatch this video and try that for the first, 4 or 5 that we've already done. But now we're going to go on to question number 6, critic. The criticism of the popular film comedy Quirks for not being realistic is misguided. It is certainly true that the characters are too stylized to be real people. That could be problematic, but in this case, the resulting film is funny. And that is the important thing for a comedy. The question asks, which one of the following principles, if valid, most helps to justify the reasoning in the critic's argument? So, here we see that there is a critic. He or she has an argument. And now, if the following is true, it's going to help this argument be even stronger. We're trying to find a way to strengthen this argument. So again, we have to break down and think for ourselves. What is the argument? The argument is that it's not okay to criticize quirks. Again, here's the tricky part. There's a lot of words in there, a lot of double negatives that happen. The criticism of the comedy quirks for not being realistic is misguided. Those are 3 negative things all happening at the same time. So I simply back my way into it and try to take it piece by piece using common language. So common language would be, for example, like I just said, it is not okay to criticize quirks, right? The criticism is misguided. Hey, do not criticize quirks. Yeah, it's true that there's not very much realism, right? The characters are stylized, but that's not what matters in a comedy. Being funny is what matters. So now that I've restated what this argument is, now I have to think about, well, what would be making it stronger? Maybe you think for a while, I'm talking about a few seconds, right? 30 seconds or less. You can't come up with one. Here's a case where that could be the case. Because it's just hard to come up with from your own head, to come up with a connector, a strengthening argument. So let's just pretend we could not come up with something. So now we're diving into the answer choices a little bit more blindly. Let's look at answer choice A. Films should be judged on how well they accurately capture the world. Well, that's actually the opposite view, right? That's not going to support this argument. That's going to break it down. So A is wrong. B says films are successful as long as they are popular. Well, there's not really this talk of popular. They talked about the film being funny and that being important. They did not talk about it being popular as being important. So B is incorrect. How about C? Film comedies should find their humor in their stylistic portrayals. Well, that seems possible because it does talk about stylistic portrayals. It talks about how people are stylized. But is it about finding their humor in those portrayals? It's hard to say. Let's pretend, for instance, that you felt like C was an okay answer choice. And so for now, we stick with it. Just so we can pretend that that's the case and see what happens next. D also sounds good. Films are successful if they succeed within their genre, because we did say the genre of comedy, to be funny is what's important in that genre. So D sounds pretty good. How about E? Films should try to stay entirely within a single genre. The passage does not really say that. So at this point, we're left with two answer choices, C or D. This is where the last principle of which holds water better comes into play. We have to determine, is C better or D better? The way to do that is to see which one holds its water better, which one retains its true principles and really sounds like it's connected to the passage better. Let's start with C. Film comedies should find their humor in their stylistic portrayals. So if that's valid, is that going to strengthen this argument? That comedies should be humorous because of the portrayals. Does that connect in? When we stop and really think about it, as we're able to dive deeper into these two options, we can see that it talks about how characters are actually too stylized to be real. So it's actually not C. It's not about comedies finding humor in the portrayals. It's even though comedies cannot have a real portrayal, they can still be funny. That's what it's trying to say. C is incorrect. It does not hold water when it's put into like greater scrutiny. When you look at it very, very close up, it loses its power. But D, when examined very, very close up, does not lose its power. It retains its water. How so? Because when we see that films are successful if they succeed when they're within their genre, that is pretty much complementing perfectly what they have already said, which is that it is important for a comedy to be funny. This movie is funny, and therefore if that constitutes success, then we have indeed been successful with this comedy. That's why D is stronger than C. And that, in fact, is how to apply that fifth strategy of which one holds water better. Let's move on to another question. Number 7. So again, you can pause your video, read this question, try to answer it on your own. Take 2 to 5 minutes and try to do it on your own. Now, I'm assuming you've already paused your video and now you're restarting the video to see how I analyze it. Here we go. Biologist. Marine animals known as box jellyfish have eyes with well-formed lenses capable of producing sharp images that reveal fine detail. But the box jellyfish's retinas are too far forward to receive a clear image. So these jellyfish can receive only a blurry image that reveals prominent features of objects, but not fine detail. This example shows that eyes are adapted only to an animal's needs rather than to some abstract sense of how a good eye would be designed. The argument requires assuming which one of the following. So again, you'd have to look at the argument, understand it, and then see what the missing assumption is. So we go ahead and use our brain and we think for ourselves first. And we say, what has been mentioned but not supported in the text prompt? So we go back and look at the text prompt. We read it again. We make sure we fully understand it. So they have this box jellyfish. They have these great lenses. They can see sharp images. They're capable of it. But these eyeballs are so far forward in this animal that they don't see clearly. They see only blurry images. And then finally, the conclusion is that, well, eyes are adapted only to animals' needs rather than to just what it means to be having good eyesight or having good eyes. And that's where that leap happens. You notice how they went from the clarity of sight to eyes being adapted to an animal's needs? That's a jump in logic that they made without proving it, without providing evidence. When you make a jump without providing evidence, that's called making an assumption. So the assumption then has to connect the idea of this being based on need with the idea of how well they see. So that's it right here. The idea that the eyes are adapted only to an animal's needs is a conclusion without that assumption being in place. And so our assumption has to connect those two, and let's look at the answers now. Is it A, box jellyfish are the only kind of jellyfish with retinas that do not focus clearly? We don't know. We just don't know. It's not relevant. How about B? Box jellyfish have a need, notice that word that I just highlighted, to detect prominent features of objects, but not fine details. That's perfect, right? Again, we're looking for a way to connect the need versus the clarity of the eyeballs. This does that perfectly. B is your right answer. Again, going back to what I talked about earlier today, if you feel like your radar is really good and when you have felt confident about an answer being correct, 9 times out of 10, it is correct, you are in a good place to go ahead and pick B and move on so that you don't waste time looking at answer choices C, D, and E, but instead spend that extra time working on the next question on the test. Because believe me, most people run out of time on these kinds of tests. Now, if you were less comfortable, you would want to, again, go through each answer choice. For example, C. Box jellyfish would benefit from having retinas that allowed their eyes to focus more sharply. Is that true? No, that is the opposite. That is giving evidence to why their eyes should be further back and require greater precision. That is not the argument for them having their eyeballs forward to meet the needs of what they had as a box jellyfish. C is the opposite. For that reason, it could be attractive, but you have to be aware that opposites are a kind of wrong answer choice, and hopefully you're able to identify that and cross off C. D says box jellyfish developed from jellyfish whose retinas received clear images. Again, where they received their abilities is about adaptation, but it doesn't address the needs of the box jellyfish today. We don't really care about their historical context and how they developed over time. E, box jellyfish use vision as their main means of detecting prey. Well, that could be true. That sounds good. But is it relevant to the argument? Does it talk about the animal's needs? A little bit. You might actually think that E is an okay answer, and then you'd have to go back to the whole idea of which holds water better, B or E. And if you do that comparison and dive deeper into those two final answer choices, I think you'll agree with me that B hits the nail on the head, whereas E sort of says something that is maybe relevant, but not really. So that's why B wins out. Let's look at another question. Again, pause your video, read it, try to do it on your own. Question 8. Columnist. Research shows significant reductions in the number of people smoking, and especially in the number of first-time smokers in those countries that have imposed stringent restrictions on tobacco advertising. This provides substantial grounds for disputing tobacco companies' claims that advertising has no significant causal impact on the tendency to smoke. Which one of the following, if true, most undermines the columnist's reasoning? This is a bit of a tricky question, and the reason why is that it has multiple layers going on. You have to peel back the layers like an onion. Take a moment to restate the facts. What is he or she saying? We have to first go back and say, what's the view of the tobacco companies? What are their claims? They claim that ads do not have a causal relationship with the tendency to smoke. Meaning, if we produce more ads, hey, don't worry, they're not going to smoke more, don't worry. That's what the tobacco company is claiming. But the research is showing that the number of people who smoke, and really first-time smokers, is very low when countries impose restrictions on ads. So you're seeing lower advertising means lower smoking, all right, in certain countries. So if we reduce the ability to run ads by tobacco companies, we will reduce the amount of smokers. That's the claim. And again, it goes against what the tobacco companies feel. It is grounds for disputing, meaning it goes against what tobacco companies are claiming. Now, here's the tricky part. The question says, which of the following undermines that reasoning? Whew, this is complicated. They're saying now, how do you mess with that argument? At this point, if you're thoroughly confused and you very well might be, this is one of those questions where you might just need to pass and move on. Just simply choose any answer choice. It doesn't matter what. Just fill it in because there is, again, no penalty for wrong answers. So go ahead and fill in a box, A, B, C, D, or E, and then you may just want to move on. That's going to happen for many of you. But for those of you who really are doing well on the LSAT, who really want to push to that higher level, that next level of ability, I will go through the rest of this question with you. So this undermining idea, to prove the above wrong, to prove this whole argument I gave you wrong, what would need to happen? So the argument being, tobacco companies say ads do not have a causal relation with smoking. Research shows countries that restrict ads have fewer smokers. How do we prove that wrong? The only way to prove that wrong that I could think of would be if something about those countries that are restricting the ads, there's something else, an alternative reason for why there are fewer smokers. I have no idea what that reason might be, but there's got to be some other reason. All right? And so now we look at the answer choices with that in mind. Answer A, people who smoke are unlikely to quit merely because they are no longer exposed to tobacco advertising. That would be an indication for why people would actually have a higher level of smoking. So A is wrong. It is not relevant to what we're dealing with. B says broadcast media tend to have stricter restrictions on tobacco advertising than do print media. This would say that the broadcast media is having a stricter restriction than do print. Again, they're comparing broadcast with print. That's not really relevant here. How about C? Restrictions on tobacco advertising are imposed only in countries where a negative attitude toward tobacco use is already widespread and increasing. Would that provide an alternate reason for there being less or fewer smokers? Yes, it would. It's an alternate reason for why there would be low smoking. An alternate reason meaning not because the countries restricted ads, but because, in fact, these are countries where people already have a generally negative attitude towards smokers in general. That does provide a very realistic reason why. So C is really your strongest answer choice here, and that's going to be the one that's correct. How about D? Most people who begin smoking during adolescence continue to smoke throughout their lives. Again, this talks more about people who smoke tending to not stop smoking. Not really relevant here. It doesn't have to do anything with first-time smokers or decreasing the quantity or percentage of smokers. So D is incorrect. How about E? People who are largely unaffected by tobacco advertising tend to be unaffected by other kinds of advertising as well. Again, here we're just talking about advertising and how it affects tobacco advertising versus non-tobacco advertising. Not relevant. We don't really need to worry about answer choice E. So that's how you break it down. Again, you want to think for yourself, come up with a reasonable answer to the question asked, then compare it to the answer choices, attacking aggressively and trying to eliminate wrong answers as best you can. And that's what we've done here in question number 8. I'm probably going to just do one more with you, and that's going to be question number 9. And here we go. The actor says the following. Bertolt Brecht's plays are not genuinely successful dramas. The roles in Brecht's plays express such incongruous motives and beliefs that audiences, as well as the actors playing the roles, invariably find it difficult at best to discern any of the characters' personalities. But for a play to succeed as a drama, audiences must care what happens to at least some of its characters. So now the question asks, the conclusion of the actor's argument can be properly drawn if which one of the following is assumed. Again, it's saying, look at the argument and tell me what the missing assumption is. Okay, it's really only going to be one of two things. What strengthens this, meaning what assumption is missing, or what weakens it, meaning what evidence would make this not as good of an argument. Here it's a basic strengthening. What assumption is missing that would make this super strong? So we go in and we try to identify what the argument is in and of itself. So there again is a hole in the argument. We have to look for what is going to link the evidence to the conclusion. So we break down what each piece is. First is the conclusion. The conclusion is that Brecht plays do not succeed because an audience needs to care about its characters. That's what they say as being the main point of this particular prompt. The evidence they give is that the roles have incongruous motives and beliefs, that the roles have no personalities. So given these two pieces of information, what is the assumption? What links that piece of evidence to the ultimate conclusion? We start with roles have no personality. We end with Brecht plays do not succeed because the audiences don't care about the characters. Well, clearly, if they don't have personalities, there must be, to connect these two, a linkage between that and the caring about the characters. So with no personality comes no caring from an audience perspective. That's the missing assumption. So now that we've figured out what it is, we want to look for the answer choice that matches. Does A match? A says an audience that cannot readily discern a character's personality will not take any interest in that character. Yes, that matches perfectly. You see how that A answer choice pretty much links directly to I don't understand their personality, therefore I don't care. That's the missing piece, and that's what A does. So again, if you are very, very confident, you have your radar super strong, you're able to answer these quite well, you've proven in past practice questions that your radar is on point, then you don't have to worry about B, C, D, and E. You spend your time doing the next problem. Now, let's say your radar is not as good, your barometer is not quite as accurate, then you do still want to go through B, C, D, and E to make sure that if there's 2 or 3 answer choices, you can evaluate which one holds water better. So for those of you who are in that boat, I'm going to go through the final answers. B, a character's personality is determined primarily by the motives and beliefs of that character. That's not really helpful. It talks about personality, but it talks about how personality is defined by motives and beliefs. That's not really helping us. C, the extent to which a play succeeds as a drama is directly proportional to the extent to which the play's audiences care about its characters. So here it's linking directly the success as a drama to the understanding of caring about its characters. This one is okay. I can see why C might be of interest because it does indirectly talk about both of those things. But this whole directly proportional to is an overstatement, and so C is incorrect because it's kind of going above and beyond its bounds. It's saying too much. It's making too precise of a statement. It's not about being directly proportional. It's simply about, succeeding because an audience cares and understands the personalities. Just succeeding in general. There is no direct proportionality going on. It's not a one-to-one relationship, so to speak. So C is incorrect. Although C is attractive, I agree. D, if the personalities of a play's characters are not readily discernible by the actors playing the roles, then those personalities are not readily discernible by the play's audience. Again, it's saying that if the actors have trouble, then the audience is going to have trouble. Yes, that might be true, but again, it does not link the evidence to the conclusion. D is incorrect. Finally, E, all plays that, unlike Brecht's plays, have characters with whom audiences empathize succeed as dramas. That's outside of the scope. It's simply saying, now let's look at other plays and see how other plays do. We don't care about other plays. We're concerned with this play, this evidence, this conclusion. So don't get distracted by things that go outside of the scope. So again, answer choice A is the best answer. So with that, I've spent about almost an hour with you already. So what I'm going to do is just kind of give you a recommendation going forward, which is to simply look at the slide that talks about where you can get more information. Before we get to that, I'm going to summarize real quickly. Number 1, you need to restate things as equal. Number 2, you need to look out for if-then statements. Number 3, you need to think for yourself before you look at the answer choices. Number 4, you have to engage in active process of elimination. And finally, number 5, you have to determine if you come up with 2 or 3 final answers, which one of those final answers holds its water best. All right, that's my recap of the 5 strategies. Now on to the slide I told you about. It is lawhub.lsac.org. Here's a snapshot of what it looks like. And I took some of these questions out of one of these 4 test prep questions. But again, you have that great opportunity to practice a bunch of questions on your own. Practice makes perfect. There's no way your radar, there's no way your barometer, your gauge is going to get any better unless you practice, practice, practice. There's a reason why when Steph Curry shoots a three-pointer from beyond the arc or at 30 feet away, a lot of times he turns around and he's flying, right? He's showing off. He doesn't even look at the basket. Why? Because he already knows the basket is going in the hoop. He doesn't even need to look at that basket because he's shot this a million times, and when it comes off his fingers just right, he knows for a fact that ball is going in the hoop. That's how confident he is in his barometer. My question to you is, how confident are you in yours? If the answer is not enough, then practice more. Finally, I'd like you to please complete this short survey. Thank you so much for coming to this part 2 session of LSAT Test Prep. Make sure to pay attention for coming next week, Monday. We're going to have the final session number 3, which is going to address reading comprehension for the LSAT. And with that, I want to thank you for coming to this session.